Hello, a very warm welcome to all of you to this high-level virtual conference on European security cooperation with the Eastern Neighbourhood and the Western Balkans. My name is Mark Leonard, and on behalf of ECFR, I am in a very happy place hosting and chairing the first panel. I'll just give you a couple of minutes of background before we go into the proceedings. And our starting point on this is that there's been a lot of talk over the last couple of years about the idea of a geopolitical Europe, but there's been very little sense of what it actually means in practice. I think what is clear after the last few years is that the overall context of global politics is changing quite dramatically and forcing us to become more geopolitical. It's not just that there are obvious competitions going on between great powers, between China and America, with regional powers such as Russia and Turkey reinventing their roles in our part of the world, and other players like Iran and Saudi Arabia coming to the fore and reshaping the politics of their regions. But it's even more fundamental than that. Many of the features of everyday life that we thought of as having nothing to do with geopolitics are being weaponized, from trade to energy to cyber to the movement of people to masks and even vaccines. And as all of these ties that bind the world together are being manipulated and instrumentalized to achieve geopolitical goals, it raises quite fundamental questions for the European Union, which is founded on a mission of exiting from a world of geopolitics and great power politics and moving towards one that was based on cooperation, on the rule of law, and on free trade and fair trade. And as this proceeds, what we're seeing is nothing less, I think, than a remaking of globalization away from a lot of the win-win scenarios to which we've become accustomed to a different kind of architecture, which is leading to debate in China about dual circulation, in the US about decoupling, and in Europe, our version of that has been to talk about open strategic autonomy and European sovereignty. And that has an impact on everything in the European project, from how we think about health to climate change to industrial policy to the regulation of digital companies. But I think it's also something which is quite fundamental in terms of our neighborhood, because even in a world which is global, there are particularly important links between which are dictated by geography. And we've had various discussions about how we relate to our neighbors. Lots of different frameworks have evolved. But one of the big blind spots in a lot of this has been the idea of thinking about the neighborhood in more geopolitical terms. In fact, we have sometimes stumbled into very big geopolitical confrontations, as we did in Ukraine, without actually realizing that our behavior was seen in geopolitical terms by other players. And that, in a way, I think, is the backdrop to the discussion we're going to be having now. I have been very influenced in terms of my thinking about European engagement with the neighborhood by my colleague Nicu Popescu, who's going to speak later on, not just because of his brilliant thinking as a think tank, and we've worked together in various different iterations since the very beginning of ECFR, but when ECFR came back when Nicu came back to ECFR after some time acting as foreign minister of Moldova, he had a very sobering account of what it feels like to be one of these neighboring countries that is desperate to engage with the European Union, is desperate to become more closely aligned with the European Union, that wants to build closer relations with the European Union, but found that in many areas, actually, it was countries which were much further away, which such as the United States, who were better equipped to support his country than the European Union itself. And that's in spite of all of the money and the attention that the European Union has put into the Eastern Partnership and into building association agreements and relations with countries in our part of the world. And the biggest gap in this was was about security, not hard security, which is the area which I would have expected there to be the biggest gaps, but actually much more practical things such as support for intelligence services, cybersecurity, disinformation, and other areas where the European Union not only has a lot of resources, but even has some competencies, and where the member states could also have a lot of assets. And when Nicu came back, he started talking about this and worked closely with his colleague on the Wider Europe program, Gustav Gresse, to flesh out the idea of what security partnerships could look like, which would add an extra dimension to our policies, both the Eastern Partnership policies, but also, as we will discuss later on when we talk about the Balkans, to other kinds of association, including the accession negotiations with different players. And what is, I think, interesting about this is it's very much driven by a perceived need. It's a very practical, and it's also an interesting example of something where member states can work together with EU institutions, with each playing to their strengths, but adding to the offer which Europeans are making to some of our closest neighbours, with whom our security is so closely bound up. So the idea of this conference is really to try and enlarge the discussion about that. We're very happy to have some extremely distinguished representatives, both in the form of Tomáš Petříček, the Minister of Foreign Affairs from the Czech Republic, and Kateřina Matanová from the European Commission, but also very happy to have very senior representatives from some of the neighboring countries who can talk about what it looks like from their perspective. Nicu has got this kind of dual hat, but he can talk about his recent experiences. And we're very happy that Nikola Dimitrov, the Deputy Prime Minister of North Macedonia, is going to be speaking later. But also very happy to have some of the member states active on this as well, because I think that this is something which has to be a shared endeavour. It's not simply something for the institutions in Brussels. And delighted that we have senior representatives from the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the German Federal Foreign Office speaking later on in our second panel, which will be chaired by my colleague, Vesela Tcherneva, the Deputy Director of ECFR. So in terms of how this is going to work, I'm going to chair this first panel on security cooperation with Eastern Partnership countries. I'll briefly introduce the three speakers who I've already mentioned on that. We will then have a short coffee break before going into the second panel, which will be chaired by Vesela Tcherneva, looking at security cooperation with the Western Balkan countries. So without further ado, I will now welcome and introduce the first round of high-level panelists. First up, as I mentioned, is Tomáš Petříček, who is the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Czech Republic. It's been a great pleasure working with you, Tomáš, on various different projects on European sovereignty over the years. And we're thrilled to be talking to you about this, which we hope might even we might even inspire you to make this a theme of the Czech presidency later on, because I think it would benefit a lot from the support of a presidency going forward. Second speaker will be Kateřina Matanová, who's the Deputy Director General for DG NEAR at the European Commission. And our third speaker, before we open up to a debate, is Nicu Popescu, who's Director of the Wider Europe Programme at ECFR. And as I said earlier, the former Foreign Minister of the Republic of Moldova. So, Minister, why don't I hand over to you?
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for the introduction, and thanks to the ECFR for convening this very topical discussion about security. Indeed, the discussion about the security cooperation with the Eastern partners and countries of the Western Balkans was gaining momentum in last month, and as you assumed, Eastern Partnership and Western Balkans, including the security dimension, will be one of the priorities of Czech presidency. I take this event as a response to this interest in the topic and the way to open the broader debate. This is a needed discussion for several reasons, in my understanding. First, on the EU level, We do cooperate with our neighbors a lot in many sectors, but the security cooperation is still underdeveloped. Second, on the side of some partners, especially the associated ones, there is a high interest to cooperate, and there are clear needs. Third, the current shape of the global and regional security debate is involving ever more the areas of softer security spectrum, and we speak more often about hybrid threats. This is the field where the EU could develop a solid offer to our partners, and I believe the EU is able to address many non-military issues thanks to its comprehensive competence and powerful regulatory might. Since May 2019, the EU member states together with partners discussed the future of the Eastern Partnership. During the process, we reconfirm the core foundations of the policy, the rule of law, including judicial reforms and democratic values. One of the results of this comprehensive consultation was the joint communication on the Eastern Partnership beyond 2020, reinforcing resilience and Eastern Partnership that delivers for all. In this document, the Commission set 5 important topics for the future of the policy, but proposed the concept of resilience as its meta-narrative. How smart was that move was revealed only later when we started to acknowledge the scope of the pandemics. This direction was reconfirmed by the foreign ministers in their Council conclusions from May 11 last year, and in June at the video conference of leaders. I would like to focus a little bit more on the concept of resilience, which is, in my understanding, closely linked with the issue of security. But security treated in a comprehensive manner. In this respect, the resilience is a purely defensive concept on one hand, but a very powerful concept on the other. Of course, the precondition of the engagement in the resilience agenda is a democratic path of our partners. As Czechia, we were advocating the resilience agenda strongly, but we did have one particular idea in mind. Resilience is, as a notion, is often used in speeches. We do, however, stress that it should be transformed from the abstract concept to a very practical activity. It should aim for results, represent concrete projects, and be backed by relevant resources. In the broad area of resilience, there is one segment representing security resilience. Security is not new in the Eastern Partnership for obvious reasons. The EU is already developing security cooperation, but we believe there is wide room for increasing this cooperation, and I hope we will be able to find ways supported by all the EU member states. However, let me make one remark before we start to discuss concrete cooperation. In supporting our partners in this field, I see as counterproductive to declare an increase of the geopolitical profile, mobilizing the ghosts of power competition. We believe in the free choice of our partners and are against the imposed spheres of influence. Look, my country has historical experiences with the sphere of influence. The EU will always and should always respect the democratic preferences of our partners and be aware of their diverse situations. This diversification of the region was only reinforced by the crisis in the second semester of last year in Belarus, and also between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And here the bottom line is that both sides, the EU and its partners have their say as to the depth and size of cooperation. One principle we do acknowledge is that the EU could complement but should not duplicate an existing and efficient NATO engagement. So what are the fields I believe the EU could offer and take a lead? Some examples. There are already several approved fields of cooperation. One is the capacity building. Here again, clear division of labor should apply between the EU and NATO. In many respects, the EU security is based on the capacity of the member states, so a strong role of member states would be only natural. The EU could also provide a framework for such an engagement. Another field is a wide range of capacities allowing to cope efficiently with hybrid threats. The greatest difficulty with this kind of threat is their diffused cross-sectoral character. This is exactly where the EU can help our partners. The EU's regulatory power could make an effective push against disinformation. It can support independent media and professional journalism, promote media literacy in the countries of Eastern Partnership. Cybersecurity is another part of this hybrid family threats, where I see the space for cooperation. In Czechia, we have, for example, elaborated the national security audit, which identified weak points in the current security environment and proposed solutions. This might be part of the inspiration for our cooperation with partners. The third element of such cooperation are related certainly to the common security and defense policy and the participation of willing partners in it. They already contribute to the operations, and I believe the opening of PESCO for them was a step in the right direction. Their participation, for example, in the European Peace Facility framework could be another step. The security sector is, however, much wider, and the comprehensive treatment of resilience can offer us even other fields for cooperation. It can also get on board more allies and partners like the UK, the US, it has been already mentioned, both with vast and excellent capacities, experiences, and just be honest, authority. The method of such cooperation would always be a combination of bilateral and multilateral EU activities, but the goal should be only one: more resilient, democratic states and societies among our Eastern partners, and thus more stable EU neighborhood. Our partners should be in the driver's seat, make the effort, and the EU should support them based on the more for more basis. Let me once again thank you for opening this needed debate on an important topic. We would be certainly happy to follow the discussions because this can bring some inspiration also for second semester of next year for our Czech presidency of the EU. Thank you, Mark.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Minister. So I'm now going to ask Katerina Matanova to take over from there.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to this very important debate. And huge thanks to Niku for also the policy brief. We, in fact, are so interested in its results that we had a separate briefing with Niku for the Neighborhood and Enlargement Directorate in the European Commission. That's where I sit. And I personally look after the Eastern Partnership countries, and currently have a double hat because I'm also acting head of the support group for Ukraine. So security and what can the EU do more and better is something that we have on our table on a daily basis. So this is very, very timely discussion. I think that Mark did a very eloquent and I took a good note, because in few brief words, you really very eloquently set out the geopolitical context. And I very much agree with your notion that the EU was set up in a different time, in a time of win-win models. And we are now in a process of both only developing tools for this new world, and also changing the mindset for adapting to the world of the geopolitical competition that we are in. I think that in that little corner of the Commission where I work, that process has been sort of forced or foisted upon us early on, because looking after the 6 Eastern Partnership countries, you cannot on a daily basis divorce yourself from one of the very aggressive regional powers, as you call them, Russia, that is very present in the EU and with its hybrid warfare, but it's very much a daily reality in the Eastern Partnership countries. So very early on, we have really worked hard on seeing how to navigate the and let's be very honest, not complete consensus among the member states on what we do with the Eastern Partnership countries, and really work hard on the building blocks of security. Minister Petriček talked about the maybe boring, but I think extremely useful notion of resilience. That, and again, this was not uncontroversial initially, but we managed to make that the core theme of the next generation of Eastern Partnership, because it not only touches on issues of security resilience, cyber resilience, etc., but also the essential elements of the broader security architecture that includes strong institutions, rule of law, prosperous economies, resilient societies. So it's actually a concept that allows us to work on many aspects of building security. But going back to Mark's initial introduction, I very much agree on the need for Europe to build, I would even say, stronger geopolitical confidence, because many times it is about confidence, but this is, I would say, a medium-term haul. It's not going to happen overnight. President von der Leyen put this into her priorities to build the geopolitical commission, but this is still the moment where the tools are only being built. Minister mentioned peace stability. We are going to have a defense fund and sort of small steps. PESCO has been agreed a couple of years ago, but the important shift in the mindset that's still work underway. But let me give you a few examples of what we have been trying to do over the last couple of years, and we want to redouble in this new generation of Eastern Partnership engagements, and also see where, and very openly say where we see still the constraints on the way. So we have worked very busily over the last several years on developing tools how to first identify and then deal with disinformation. And what we have done is completely turn on its head the communication about what the EU does in the region, because we used to, I mean, one thing that the EU doesn't do very well is communication. Let's be quite honest. And in the Eastern Partnership, it became really a key necessity. So with the support of the Stratcom East group in the External Action Service, we sort of stepped away from communicating in undescribable acronyms on individual projects, and started really meta communication branding. And we developed this logo of EU4, EU number 4, and then EU for Georgia, EU for digital. So both country and thematic communication, and it has had really very good results. I mean, we have been observing over the last couple of years really a much bigger recognition of what the EU support does, and we now continue that with branding. For example, we started a very significant cybersecurity and cyber preparedness program for the East. It's called EU for Digital. With Ukraine, what was agreed recently at an association council was a separate security dialogue with the EU, which is very much seen by us as a two-way street, because we have a lot to learn from Ukraine in particular. And we invest a tremendous amount of resources and energy and time in developing the media landscape, from media literacy through supporting independent media content. And that's something which we think is very important, because the disinformation landscape is terrible. I mean, it's really daily doses of massaging of the minds, and that's something we spent a lot of energy on. Moving more into the strengthening the security services, we in fact set up a trust fund with NATO and started holding regular. We just held last week Eastern Partnership staff talks between DG NIR and the NATO colleagues, and we set up a trust fund called Building Integrity, which is essentially a trust fund to help with security reform, but even military reform, things that we cannot do directly, but NATO can, and we contribute to those efforts. And on issues of cyber resilience, etc., we are very actively working together. We are developing and running regular piloting, and we want to expand it to the whole neighborhood. So we started with Moldova and Georgia hybrid threat surveys, and trying to equip our countries to both detect and prepare for hybrid threats. And in Moldova and Ukraine, we have and Georgia, we have specific programs set up to help with security sector reform on the civilian side, because that's the sort of the bright line that we are crossing only with this support for NATO, but don't have the mandate going for that yet. The one proposal which I personally and many of my colleagues find intriguing from the policy brief, to set up these security partnerships with our Eastern partnerships, is something that we will keep on the agenda and going forward, and maybe on a pilot basis it's even foreseeable. But as everybody who deals with European policy knows, that we exist in a consensus environment among member states, and so we cannot go beyond an effective veto power of a single member state, basically, when new things are put on the table. So we'll see how that plays out, but it's certainly something that we find potentially very useful and intriguing going forward. And the last point I want to make is to give you an example of, Mark talked about weaponizing daily life and daily events around us by various aggressive actors. And that's something that we have seen a year ago in March, April, very actively coming both from Russia and China among the Eastern partners, where when the COVID pandemic started and the message was, Europe is only looking at itself and they abandoned you, and you know, what is it good for you to look towards the EU? That was the narrative, and that's when we really very quickly mobilized and worked. I remember a very busy Easter time last year, and under rubric of Team Europe, we actually were able to organize very quickly deliveries of personal protective equipment and support to the medical systems and the emergency needs. And what was interesting, what we decided is that not only we are going to provide this assistance, but we need to communicate about it in a smart way. And we did that. And this was really the first time when I saw the power of us doing things differently, because when we ran the surveys in early July across the region, EU was identified in all 6 countries as the number one helper, the number one entity that helped. And so I was very much hoping that this is going to be the acquis and the model for the future. We didn't do so well on vaccines, unfortunately. But we didn't do so well on vaccines even inside the member states, not only in the Eastern Partnership. But I think that the communication, strategic communication, and working on preparedness and resilience is, in addition to concrete assistance in security sector reform, and as I mentioned, the work with NATO, I think are important building blocks. Are we there yet fully to what the brief would have aspired to? No, but I think that these are useful and important steps, and I very much welcome this conversation about how we can do things better.
Thank you very much, Katerina. So Niku, why don't you introduce your thinking in the paper, and also maybe react to some of the things that the Minister and Katerina have just been saying.
Thank you very much, Mark, Minister Petricek. Katerina, it's great to see you, and thanks for your kind words of support. And the story and what were kind of the source, the inspiration for this discussion was this policy brief that Gustav Gressel and I published with the CFR recently. It's called The Best Defense: Why the EU Should Forge Security Partners, security compacts with its Eastern neighbors. And that's also started as an initiative that we launched in an op-ed with former foreign ministers of Ukraine and Georgia, Pavlo Klimkin and Ekat Keshalashvili, where we called on the EU to start developing security cooperation with selected Eastern partners. And the thinking behind this idea is coming from several directions. One is, of course, this new and more publicized ambition that the European Union has, and that is to build a more geopolitical Europe, to speak the language of power, and to be strategically autonomous or sovereign, meaning that a desire to have the capacity to be influential, not just on socio-economic and political diplomatic issues, but also on security issues. And that's an ambition that we have seen growing across Europe. And of course, the second source of inspiration behind this idea of ours was just the fact that we look at our neighborhood. We have several wars. We have an increasing number of conflicts. As you know, Syria and Libya have been in a very difficult situation for a decade. In the Eastern Partnership, as we speak, 5 of the 6 Eastern Partnership countries are in the middle of acute domestic or even external political and security crisis. And what we're seeing with this crisis is that the voice of the European Union is heard, but perhaps is not as influential as we would like it to be. So with all of this in mind, we've started kind of reflecting with Gustav what did the European Union did well in terms of Eastern Partnership, but what are those lacunas which limit the leverage of the European Union to have a greater impact on developments in its own neighborhood. And of course, what is relatively easy to see is that the Eastern Partnership has been designed with primarily socioeconomic goals in mind. You have a pretty good dynamic and pretty well-developed policies when it comes to fostering free trade, visa-free travel, energy partnerships, institution building, capacity building support for phytosanitary agencies, for export promotional agencies. All of that is being done. Sometimes it's more effective, sometimes less, but the EU is more than a decade into trying to develop policies which help Eastern partners consolidate their socioeconomic situation and political trajectories. Where the EU has been much more shy to act, of course, has been on the security front. And it is exactly on this front that the situation has been deteriorating. We've had the recent war in Nagorno-Karabakh, the war in Ukraine, and throughout these wars, what was also obvious that the European Union was not necessarily the first actor that these neighbors of the EU were willing to listen to when it came to the course of this war. So we've designed this idea, and we've kind of trying to alert the European policymakers to the need to start doing something about this for several reasons. One is to, of course, try and stabilize the neighborhood, but second is also as a way to build European leverage on those bits of the state apparatuses and public institutions in the neighboring countries, which are least open to and have been least exposed to interaction with the European Union. Also, if we look at what the other powers are doing, and if we assume that the European Union wants to be more of a power, then we would see that several neighboring powers to the EU have been heavily invested in developing security partnerships with Europe's neighbors or their neighbors. What we describe is more or less what Turkey has been doing with Azerbaijan. I think quite recently it was quite impressive how Turkey has been starting to develop defense cooperation and defense industrial cooperation with a country like Ukraine. Actually, Turkey by now is probably more ambitious and far ahead most of the European Union when it comes to defense cooperation ambitions with a country like Ukraine. And in some due course, we will have Turkish-built drones in eastern Ukraine, probably facing Russia's military presence there. And at the same time, Turkey continuously guarding a politically good and diplomatically respectful relationship with Moscow that is, of course, strikingly different than the EU-Russia dialogue that we have seen. Another country that has been doing quite systematic security partnerships as a way to boost its influence is, of course, Russia. And Russia hasn't been doing this only in the post-Soviet space. This methodology of doubling down on security partnerships with the defense establishments, with the security apparatuses, has been something Russia has been doing quite systematically in a country like Serbia, in parts of Bosnia, in the Central African Republic, in Libya. And all of that has given Russia much more influence than the investments Russia did, not least in a country like Serbia, and we'll be discussing Serbia on the next panel. But of course, we have a striking situation where the EU has been channeling billions into the Western Balkans, and but has been shying away from some security cooperation, which limits Europe's influence. Of course, the Americans are a power that have been doing that quite systematically across the board. And we also have EU member states which have been developing their own close security partnerships with neighbors. Of course, France has been one of the most active states in this regard with countries like Morocco or Tunisia or across Africa. So lots of powers are doing that. That's trying to boost their security profile internationally. And I think it's quite logical if Europe wants to be more geopolitical relevant and more powerful in influencing developments in its neighborhood, is to start addressing and start upgrading its regional policies, not least the Eastern Partnership, to this need to start interacting more with the security sectors of selected neighboring states. And of course, just to kind of address some of the questions regarding to the scope of this, of course, we can only do this with countries that are open to doing that. And in the Eastern Partnership, that presumably means just Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova, which have this very kind of thick arrangement of cooperation with the EU, and that is framed by the association agreement, where the EU has been increasingly present in the non-military and the soft parts of the security sector, with rule of law, judicial and police cooperation and support for reform in these sectors. But what we don't have yet is the European Union trying to play a more active role on the harder parts of the security sectors of its neighboring states. Of course, Minister Petricek and Katarina spoke quite a lot about cooperation with NATO. And that's, of course, the starting point of any relevance for the influence of the European Union and the EU member states in their own neighborhood. But also there's some countries and some parts of our neighborhood where it is more difficult to pursue security cooperation through NATO. Now, Serbia is a case in point, of course. I think there it's easier to try and develop greater security links through institutions other than NATO for obvious reasons, but also in the Eastern Partnership countries. In a country like Moldova, which is neutral, again, it's somewhat easier to do specific things through the EU. But even for Georgia and Ukraine, very often, whenever you want to scale up cooperation with NATO, that immediately rings alarm bells in several NATO and EU capitals, because people look at cooperation with these countries through the prism of NATO enlargement. And that also sometimes prevents some potential cooperative projects. I mean, the truth is that we as the European Union and NATO need security cooperation with neighbors irrespective and in parallel to the question of enlargement. I mean, one way to look at it is, the United States has a security partnership with Taiwan or Egypt, but the United States is not about to enlarge to Taiwan or Egypt. These security partnerships are developed on top or in addition or in parallel to the membership issue. So I think sometimes, because the NATO membership issue is so controversial when it comes to enlargement to the East, some things might be easier achieved in a format, in cooperation with NATO, but also on different tracks, which should, of course, be complementary to NATO. So what exactly are we arguing for in our security compact? And security compact idea. And here I want to kind of clarify a few things. We are, of course, not arguing for new European military bases outside the EU. What we're arguing for is not exactly a greater role in conflict settlement and conflict mediation. That's a useful thing to do. But the European Union has been more or less present, or the EU member states have been present in Ukraine, over Georgia's conflicts, in Moldova's conflict settlement format. That should continue. But as you know, these things are difficult. What we're also considering that it's very useful if a neighboring state participate in CSDP missions, but that's very small as an objective to be achieved, because, if 10 or 20 Ukrainian or Moldovan policemen participate in some EU missions, that's good for the bilateral relationship, but it's not yet arriving to a situation where the EU can have a transformative and decisive effect on security developments in a country like Ukraine, Moldova, or Georgia. So in this sense, what we've been arguing for is for large or significant, or at least some parts of the European neighborhood funding and political attention to go into security issues. And for this attention and funding to go into capacity building for the security sector. And more or less what the EU has been doing with phytosanitary agencies or export promotion agencies or stuff like that, and try and do similar capacity building with intelligence services, with the military, with training, with more exchanges, with equipment supply. And here, again, it's not an open call to send weapons. There are a lot of things that can be done to support and to boost military partnerships without supplying weapons. I mean, some very, very basic things. For example, the Americans have been supplying and offering, gym sport equipment to the militaries of these countries. That looks like quite basic, but it has created new channels of dialogue and capacity building support even before any conversation about weapon supplies has taken place. Of course, on the cyber front, there are significant needs. The European Commission, unlike in other aspects of security, the European Commission actually has some powers to do more on the cyber front. And for example, an agency like ENISA, the European Network Information Security Agency, does not even have as part of its mandate engagement with neighboring or third countries. So at some point, it's useful to just do a kind of screening and a monitoring of the mandates of agencies like ENISA or EDA, just to open these agencies to more cooperation with the neighbors. Of course, that's already, I think, factored in the preparation of a Romanian-based cybersecurity agency. But there's a need to do a kind of more systematic opening of the EU institutions to cooperation with the neighbors on these harder parts of the security apparatuses. I'll probably stop here, and I'll just kind of finish by saying that that's an ongoing reflection we are having. Some of our listeners maybe saw already the paper. If not, you can Google it. We'll send the link on the chat, and you have some 30 specific ideas as to how the European Union can develop security cooperation with its neighbors. But we want to go in and develop this thinking in details. We've also been in touch, and we've been exploring ways to work together with the next presidencies of the European Union, with Slovenia, with France, with the Czech Republic, and with Romania. As you know, these countries have different national priorities, but we think that the conversation about Europe's relevance and Europe's influence on security development in our own neighborhood is something that is equally important to all of these presidencies. We've also been working with DigiNear and several other member states and trying to develop and detail some of these proposals, and we'll be back with more events in the future. So please stay tuned to our work on these matters. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Wonderful. So we've got about 25 minutes to have a debate and a discussion around these issues. I want to make sure that we have time to go back to all the speakers at the end, but it'll be good to get some comments and some questions. If people, two people have discovered the Q&A box, and I would like to encourage other people to, to ask questions on the Q&A box or to raise your hand so that we can see you. You will, I applaud the two people who've discovered it so far for their hyperactivity, but you'll have more success if you put one question in rather than 3 or 4 questions, because I have a limited attention span for other people. But why don't we go to Johannes Ahlefeld first, and you can ask one of your 3 or 4 questions that you've put in our box. Is it possible to bring people in, or should I read one of them out? Okay, I'll read it out while we wait for other people then. So, dear Tomasz, you have also observed serious attempts at disinformation in the context of recent elections in the Czech Republic or the current COVID-19 crisis, as reported for Germany in an EAS report earlier this week. Which kind of strategies in the area of cybersecurity have you developed, knowing that Czechia has a lot of smart startups in the industry? Why don't we go straight to you then, Minister, while we wait for other people to put questions in the box or raise their hands.
Thank you, Mark. I would be more competent to respond the first part of the question. Yes, we have observed attempts at disinformation in terms of especially the current pandemic. There is a clear narrative that is trying to undermine the trust in public measures that should stop the spreading of the virus. And we have seen also that there is very active disinformation scene when it comes to vaccination, for example. in terms, in the context of elections, we are very sensitive on any disinformation attempts. We have seen some of them, but we haven't probably seen such a big impact on the election outcome or the democratic debate so far. But this doesn't mean that we are not aware about the need to develop proper tools to be it debunk disinformation campaigns, alert the public when this is happening. On cyber security, I'm very frankly, it's very technical, very complex topic, and I'm not an expert here, so I don't want to dig deep into the details of the strategies. But we are, for example, working very hard on the upgrade of the response systems for attempts to attack, for example, public institutions. We have seen, for example, last year also that we need to broaden the strategy and include other sectors, not only public institutions in terms of ministries or public offices, but we witnessed attacks against hospitals in the first wave of the pandemic. And it is clear that the cybersecurity is not something where somebody is trying to get only sensitive information, but that you need to protect the key functions of the critical infrastructure, so that nobody is capable, for example, of switching off the whole hospital through malwares, or I don't know what else, or electricity generation system, for example. This is something where you need to really identify the sensitive points in the whole system and protect them against possible interference through cyber attacks.
Great, thank you very much. While we wait for other people to come in, maybe I can sort of press Katerina and Tomasz to help us think through a bit more about, if you take all of the issues that Niku mentioned as part of the Security Compact, how are they best taken forward? Because I think some of these things can be taken forward best within the EU, because there are EU competencies and there are already tools which might be adapted. Other things, as the minister said, might be better done through NATO. And then a third basket of issues are things which member states might want to take forward bilaterally, but hopefully in a coordinated manner, so that the whole can be more than the sum of its parts. Niku, do you want to talk a bit about that? And then it would be great to hear Katerina and Tomasz talk both from an EU perspective in Brussels, but also from the perspective of a member state. Yeah, great.
Yeah, okay. Yes, I'm not, listen, I think we have a situation where most of the member states that have been doing some of what I described on a bilateral basis in Eastern Europe, of course, don't have major resources to mobilize behind such security cooperation with third countries. That's one element of that. Also, by the way, that the same applies to NATO. NATO is very good at having the right expertise and the right, bureaucratic culture and an understanding of security issues, but NATO doesn't have, again, significant resources to deploy for cooperation with third countries. If we look at the EU side, the EU has quite a lot of resources that it invests and it invests in its foreign policy, but it has not been designing its foreign policy with security matters as a priority. So in this sense, I think there's quite sort of coordination, but also mutual support that can be done between the EU, what some of them have been doing. Today, we have also a situation where, for example, the UK is quite active in engaging in security cooperation with the EU's eastern neighbors. And unlike, whereas when you look at most of the mostly Central Eastern European countries that are willing to do that in Eastern Europe, they of course don't have the resources of a large member states. They don't have the large armies. They don't have eventually even like surplus of non-lethal equipment. They don't have similarly big education institutions in the military. They don't have extra people to help with an analysis of critical infrastructure vulnerabilities outside their countries. You know, because sometimes we're even speaking about potentially the need of trying and sending a team of 5 or 10 people to Ukraine for a few weeks to try and understand actually what are the cyber vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure, in railways, in power plants. And, you know, if you go to a country that to the countries that have been willing to do that, they don't necessarily have the extra 5-10 cyber specialists that they can detach to such a task. So in this sense, I think there is a way and the need to try and merge Europe's, the EU's and Brussels resources with the expertise and the desire of member states and try and scale up the work that has been done on this front. And of course, there's the transatlantic element, 30 seconds here. I think it's also important for us to develop, you know, the idea of a new burden sharing in the transatlantic relationship, not just through the prism of the 2% that NATO member states spend in NATO. I think an important element of this burden sharing debate and potentially reinforced transatlantic partnership is not just the defense of NATO member states, but also how the EU and NATO are able to shape their neighborhood in a positive way and how they can develop stronger partnerships with third countries. So to me, this cooperation with neighboring countries, be it Serbia or Ukraine, is also something that must not be forgotten as part of the transatlantic re-energization of relations and the debate on a fairer burden sharing, where the Europeans assume a higher share of responsibility for what happens in security on the European continent. And that what happens in security, again, should also apply to third countries.
Okay. Some great questions coming in the box, which we'll come to later, but I'll go to Katerina to talk a bit more in more detail about what you think the EU could take on board. You mentioned obviously a lot in your opening remarks, so you don't have to go over everything that we've already learned from you, but if there are additional thoughts about what could be done in an EU context, and then I'll go back to the Minister to talk about the member states and the bilateral front.
I actually will just have a very simple proposition. What I think is missing, and this is the step that one will have to bring all the member states to embrace that notion, and we're not there yet, is to, in fact, put our various, because while you were asking the question, I went through actually reams of paper here electronically with individual different projects on what we have been doing on security, security service of Ukraine reform, etc. And what is really missing is to drive it with the overall narrative and political push. That's what's missing. And that's what the security compact that Nico is arguing for would do. And for that, I think we need to build the constituency, and discussions like this are hopefully going to inch us closer to that. So what we have been doing, because of, as I mentioned, in our part of the world, in the Eastern Partnership, we are forced by the area reality. We have sort of, through stealth or through activities, have been developing the individual bits and pieces, including developing a program to support with the civilian side of reform of the military. That's what the trust fund with NATO, for example, is designed to do. But what is missing, and what we need to And hopefully we will get to it, because I think it's really important for Europe and for its own geopolitical self-confidence, as I said, is to project this overall trend towards the neighborhood as well as the Western Balkans, that we would in fact get into the step of the security compacts where things can be brought and the various activities can actually be brought into a coherent framework. But I think this is still going to take some time. We are not there yet.
Okay, great. So I'll go back to you now, Minister.
Let me start by saying that, and maybe explaining more details what I meant, that we should not go into very detailed discussion about geopolitics. First of all, EU is very often slow when it comes to reacting. It's 27 member states that need to find an agreement. And geopolitical trends will be there even without us contemplating too much about geopolitics. And instead, we should focus on practical cooperation with our partners. I think that this is exactly what Niku was mentioning. Be it in terms of capacity building, be it in terms of transfer of knowledge, be it in terms of involvement in CSDP activities of the European Union. And that we can certainly find other areas. And we can provide a packaging to it under the label of resilience, because this is actually the concept that partners' ownership is there. It is based on an effort of the partners, and the EU can provide the resources where we identify the needs, where we need to focus on a practical reaction to different vulnerabilities of not only state institutions in the Eastern Partnership, but also the whole societies. And this means also that the EU would provide resources, be it at the EU level or be it individual member states, through the partnership. So in many areas, I believe that the way of thinking is very similar. We might probably continue in the debate about details, but the practical cooperation, in my understanding, can bear very tasty fruits soon, especially in countries where the willingness is higher in engaging with the EU in a security cooperation bigger.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that. So there are some really interesting questions in the box. Maybe I'll just put in a few of them. One question from Adriana Stanescu is about, says, considering the preparations going on for the next Eastern Partnership Summit in the autumn, would you see a place for specifically defined further objectives as follow-up to the discussions initiated with ECFR paper on strengthening EU power in the neighbourhood? We'd be very interested to get your comments on that. A second question is about Turkey from Tinetin, which says Turkey does not come in the region with the same agenda as the EU, which has normative and transformative agenda. Is that why it's tolerated by Russia more? Will EU security cooperation be tolerated in the same way? Be interesting to look at that. Then there's a specific question about France, how it's very keen to put security cooperation in bilateral security cooperation with southern countries, but puts the brakes on it with Eastern Partnership countries. I'm not sure if anyone wants to comment on that. And then the final set of questions from Juliana Schmidt. How do you expect to build political will for more security cooperation from the side of the member states? In the end, this is the underlying challenge and why the EU is still quite inactive on this front. So maybe we should stop there. why don't we take those 4 questions, and maybe we start with you again, Minister. We'll just go in the same order that we did the first time round.
If I may, briefly on Eastern Partnership Summit, I see a space for a follow-up to the discussions that has been initiated among the member states through the engagement with experts. I'm not yet well informed how far, for example, the Slovenian presidency would like to work with that. Maybe Niku can provide a more detailed answer. On the question of France, I believe that this also is linked also to the last question raised by Julian Schmidt about willingness for closer cooperation, security cooperation among member states. I think it's about working harder on strategic convergence. Means that we in the EU needs to really work that we convene, or we can at least get closer together on understanding the security topics, security challenges in different areas. First, for example, it is about Central European countries as Czechia being increasingly interested in the situation in our southern neighborhood. That hasn't been traditionally the case. Providing the partnership with the countries on the southern flank, for example, of the European Union. And at the same time, engaging them in a regular discussion about what do we see as threats or as challenges in our eastern neighborhood or in other areas that are much closer to us geographically, politically, and in security terms as well. So we should try to avoid that we will be a group of usual suspects, that when we speak about Eastern Partnership, it's the Baltic states, Central European states, Romania, Slovenia, and the rest is not interested. And the same applies that it is not only Mediterranean countries interested in the southern neighborhood, but it is also us who engage with them, who work with them on the projects there, and who use the resources available for achieving the common goals. For me, for example, this is the reason why Czech Republic is so much involved now in Sahel. It is not a traditional priority for my country, but it's increasingly a priority for the future, because this is a common threat or common challenge for the whole EU. It is not possible to say, look, this is an issue that only our Spanish friends, Italian or French friends should be concerned with. So let's talk to each other on a regular basis, even more informally, and let's work on strategic convergence so that we all share the understanding what the challenges for all of us are.
Great,
and
thank you.
We can mobilize the resources more effectively as well for that.
Thank you very much. We've got about 4 minutes left. So Katerina, do you want to take 2 of them, and then we'll give the last 2 to Niku before we go into the coffee break?
Okay, thanks a lot. Just to continue on what Minister Petříček mentioned, this is the whole idea of having a neighborhood policy that spans such different places as Libya and Armenia into a policy to avoid the echo chambers of usual suspects only caring about one and the other one, and the other part of Europe caring about the south. So this has not been too successful until now, but it's very encouraging to hear a Central European talk about Sahel, and I think there is increasingly more recognition that it's in everybody's interest to care about both parts of the neighborhood. But we are where we are. I'm mentioning it the 3rd time now. This is in response to the question on the Eastern Partnership Summit. everything that goes into Eastern Partnership Summit has to be unanimously agreed by the 27, but also endorsed by all 6 on the side of the partner countries. So I don't think that deepen beyond what I already mentioned, which is the hybrid, resilience to hybrid warfare, cybersecurity, cyber preparedness, which is already very well established. I don't think that Eastern Partnership Summit is the vector through which we can go deeper into what Niku and Gustav were proposing in there, because it's an inclusive framework, and I can name at least 2 of our partner countries who would not agree to deeper cooperation. So the Eastern Partnership Summit will be more about the socioeconomic issues, will be more about trade, will be about cybersecurity, will be about resilience, but it's not going to explore new avenues, because for that you need willing partners on the other side, and that you cannot find in this inclusive concept of 6, because of all the issues that we discussed, and the wars and conflicts, etc. I mean, we don't even have clarity on who's exactly going to be invited from the 6 countries. So I'll stop at that. And but just to one point that I didn't mention, we are currently developing and conceptualizing what we can do more and more coherently. And we already started the discussion with Niku, and we actually want to engage with think tanks and thinkers on these issues to really get it right. So that's one of the reasons why I'm delighted that I was able to be here today, but we are going to be reaching out to experts to really help us think through and push the envelope and push us a little bit into greater coherence and going the extra mile. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Katerina. So the last word to Niku.
Thank you very much. Maybe I'll have to address the France question, but do so also in a way that does not completely exclude Germany. I think these are today the 2 biggest member states, and without them, it will be hard to advance in boosting and strengthening Europe's security influence in its neighborhood. And I think both countries have been on a trajectory that is recognizing the fact that something needs to be done. And here I, of course, before talking about France, I'd like to also say that, of course, Germany traditionally feels very uncomfortable with hard power issues. So what we've been talking today about is something which German diplomacy does not necessarily find traditionally a comfortable conversation to be had. At the same time, we know that recently Germany has been more and more open to the understanding and the idea that the EU needs to help selected Eastern partners to be stronger in facing hybrid and cyber threats. And that's been something which has been more or less put on the record by the German MFA recently. And in this sense, even if it's not very comfortable, Germany has been increasingly open to such ideas. Now, when it comes to France, I do find that and it's somewhat unfair because we'll have French and German representatives on the next panel. But I do find that this conversation that we had is in perfect tune with France's ambition for Europe. France is one of the countries that wants an ambitious Europe in security matters, an ambitious Europe on digital and cyber matters. France wants Europe to be strong vis-a-vis Turkey, vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Russia. And our idea that we've been promoting, of course, fits very much in this French desire to see a stronger Europe. And in this sense, I think that France has the right expectation and the right ambition for Europe that can integrate this need to boost security cooperation with Europe's eastern neighbors. And in recent years, I think it's also fair to say that France has been investing much more in stepping up its partnership with Central Europe, with the Baltic states, with Poland, with the Czech Republic, with Romania. Just recently, the French MOD just published a Black Sea strategy, which is something that wasn't necessarily part of French defense planning as much in recent years. We have much more visits, much more partnerships. And in this sense, we also see a similar outreach by Minister Petricek spoke about the Czech outreach, but of course the Romanians and the Baltic states and the Poles have been more present in trying to support European priorities in sub-Saharan Africa and the wider Middle East. So I think there's a two-way street there where France has been more present and more willing to invest in improving in strengthening its security interaction with Central Europe. But of course, from that, it's just one step to realize that Black Sea security or Baltic Sea security also means the need to strengthen the security links with the countries which are just outside the EU and NATO border, because security, as we all know, doesn't stop at borders, and your borders are much more functional when you have friends on the other side of your border. And in this sense, as I said, our ideas are perfectly in tune with what France has been willing to push Europe to do in a lot of other places.
Great. Thank you very much to all of you. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. I think a great start to the conference. We're now going to have a coffee break until 11:30 Central European time. We will, however, leave this webinar open for people who want to hang around and engage with each other through the chat box and in other ways. And after the break, we will be restarting promptly at 11:30, looking at the idea of security cooperation with the Western Balkans. And my colleague Vesna Chanova is going to bring you an all-star cast to make sense of that, including Nikola Dimitrov, the Deputy Prime Minister for European Affairs from the Republic of North Macedonia, Frédéric Mondolini, the head of Continental Europe Division in the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who will no doubt be able to comment on what Niku and others have just said, and our colleague Susanna Schutz, who is the Director for Southeast Europe, Turkey and EFTA states in the German Federal Foreign Office. I hope you enjoy your coffee break and look forward to seeing you back at 11:30. Many thanks to all of you. Maybe you can join me in giving a virtual round of applause to our speakers on the first panel.